All right. I'm going to get started here. Thanks for coming. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Twin Cities Drupal Camp and to the session on using Grunt to manage build and testing tools. Just before we start, how many have used Grunt before? Okay, great. And does anyone use it on a daily basis or as part of their current workflow? Cool. All right. Just to get me kicked off on the right foot here, can you all give me a big grunt on the count of 3? 1, 2, 3. All right, thank you. So I'm Joe Turgeon. I'm a director of engineering at Phase 2, I get to help get projects started and think about developer tools and kind of how to make our process efficient. So I just want to start off by kind of asking, does Drupal need a build tool? Because I'm suggesting introducing Grunt. What purpose does it serve? What role does it have? And I think why does Drupal need a dev tool or a build tool? And that has to do with the way that Drupal development has evolved, over the years and as our practices have evolved. So I think we're probably all at some point started with a very simple approach of getting a Drupal site up, downloading core and contrib modules from Drupal.org, adding your custom code, and pushing that up to a server. But as we've worked on more complex projects, a more complex workflow has come. So we might be using Drush make to pull down core and contrib code. We're still adding our custom code, but now we're running code checks on it. So checking coding style. We're compiling Sass to CSS. We're using Behat or other testing tools to do testing of our site, and then using some maybe a Git process to commit and deploy the code. So I think Drupal development has become a little more complex, and I think for good reasons. It's giving us flexibility in the process we have. So just why are we kind of taking this approach? Why do we want to build Drupal? One thing is ending the anti-pattern of mixing core and contrib code with your custom code. So in kind of the first approach I was talking about, you'd probably have your built-out Drupal doc root where you've got core, and then under that you've got your custom code and also contrib code. And I think there are some good reasons to want to separate out the code that you're developing that's custom from the code that you're inheriting from other sources. One way that plays into building is that if you have something like a Drush make file that says, I'm pulling this version of Drupal core, these versions of contrib files, you have a nice file that gives you a full inventory of what's building your Drupal site outside of custom code. And so it gives you good visibility into what the site is built with. Additionally, it makes the use of external libraries and resources easier. So, Drupal is taken on kind of the proudly invented elsewhere model where we're pulling in jQuery libraries or different front-end resources, maybe some PHP libraries that we're pulling from the outside of Drupal community to augment our site functions. And so we're not just pulling stuff from Drupal.org anymore, but we're pulling from projects across the internet in different development communities. So having a common way to pull those dependencies in and then know you can reproduce that is important. And so that leads into enforcing reproducibility and automation as just part of your process. Moving to a place where you can fully rebuild your Drupal site, including like downloading core, contrib files, all the dependencies, just in a very simple command. And so you could think about this as if you add another team member, you're able to say, hey, just run this one command, and you've built out all the components of our Drupal site. Why do you want to test Drupal? And here I'm thinking, behavioral or functional testing. I think, often and very quickly, I think with Drupal, you can get to complex sites that you can't really sufficiently test by just clicking around. We might have been able to get away with a few years ago. You have lots of user roles, and so to verify that these different roles can do things on the site takes going into users in that role, and that's just a time-consuming process. And so having better resources to test Drupal really is a way to empower developers to produce better quality code and make the development iteration cycle tighter and more efficient. It also allows you to find regressions and code style issues before you've committed the code and before now other people are maybe seeing those issues. So it allows developers to take more accountability and responsibility for the work that they're doing, knowing that once they push it out and it's integrated, it has a higher chance of not introducing problems or having to come back to you and fix problems later. So hopefully I've made a case for kind of augmenting your Drupal workflow with a process to build, also a process to test. But it leaves a couple open questions. One is, how do we make sure that everyone uses these tools in the same way? So we've now introduced Drush Make, maybe we have Compass for compiling Sass, Behat for running tests. Does everyone need to know how to run each of these tools individually? Also, none of these tools necessarily address how do you separate your custom source code from dependencies. I think this is still not addressed by the tools themselves. So here's why I want to introduce Grunt as a tool that will help kind of tie these different parts together. Just quickly, why Grunt? So what is Grunt? It's a JavaScript-based task runner. So it's something written in JavaScript, and it's just about running tasks that you define. Just like Drupal, it has a very big community. It's widely adopted. It's flexible. There's a large base of plugins that people are contributing, and so kind of its use cases and how it can be used is growing day by day. It's pretty lean in its dependencies. It does depend on Node.js, which is not something that Drupal requires. So this is introducing kind of a new requirement. But Node is fairly easy to install and get up and running. So it's not a major barrier. It also has a fairly straightforward approach. You write tasks in JavaScript, and you write configuration in JSON. And those two elements, JSON and JavaScript, are already part of Drupal development. So this isn't a very foreign tool. And as I was mentioning earlier, it has a really large base of plugins, more than 4,000 last time I checked. And just like the Drupal modules, they're based on people finding an itch that they want to scratch and feeling like, hey, this is something that could be general purpose. So it's nice to be able to go out there and find stuff that you can apply to your work. So hopefully I've sold you a bit on Grunt, at least so far. I'd encourage you, if this is the first time you're kind of hearing about Grunt or haven't tried it out, to just check out the Grunt.js Getting Started page, which has a great tutorial of just walking you through the first kind of Grunt script that you can put together. So Grunt, like I said, is really flexible, and you can use it for a lot of different purposes. So one thing that we started working on a little over a year ago was kind of a common library of Grunt tasks, specifically related to Drupal development and the Drupal development workflow. And we call this Grunt Drupal Tasks. And so this is a Grunt plugin for performing common Drupal build and testing tasks. This is open source and on GitHub, and also on NPM. And I'll talk a little bit later about how to get that and try it out. It started as an R&D project last January, and then since March of last year, it really became adopted internally at Phase 2 for the projects we've been doing for clients. And so we've been using on projects big and small for over a year now. We released on GitHub last September. And just this last spring, we kind of finalized support for both, well, for Drupal 8 in addition to Drupal 7. So this plugin can support both code bases. A few things about what we're trying to provide with Grunt Drupal Tasks is it comes with opinions. The idea is that this is a good baseline to start at, where we're trying to enforce certain practices that we consider best practices, and also that we want to see everyone on our teams using, and then also being able to use those same practices in things like continuous integration environments, and testing sites. It does presume a certain code workflow, which I sort of illustrated a little bit earlier, and we'll get into it more. But the idea that you are going to verify the quality of custom code using things like PHP lint or ESLint, that you're not going to put all your core and contrib files in your repository, but you're going to be building that from a Drush makefile. And then that you want to run tests afterwards to verify that the custom functionality you're building works appropriately and according to certain requirements. And it also introduces the idea of a project scaffold for a Drupal site. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. Another thing that Grunt Drupal Tasks helps with is bringing these tools together. So it's about using Compass for compiling Sass to CSS, using Behat for running functional tests, using Drush make. It's about kind of having this constellation of tools that you can kind of bring together under a single task runner. And although it does want to enforce certain standards and expectations, it does try to stay out of your way a bit. So we try to provide sensible defaults so it's usable out of the box, but allow you to override that through configuration. It manages its own dependencies. So I talked about things like Behat and Compass, and one barrier to using those tools is sometimes just getting them set up on your machine so you can run them. And Grunt Drupal Tasks actually does a lot of the work in defining what it requires, and then helping you set those up. And then, as I mentioned, it kind of gives you this one single point of entry to your toolbox. And so, when new people come on a project, it makes the set of tools that you've defined kind of more ready to use and discoverable. So I'm going to introduce one other tool that we've been working on. How many of you have heard of a Yeoman generator? A few? Yeah. So this Yeoman is another tool. It's kind of part of the landscape that Grunt is in. And its kind of special purpose is about creating new projects, or kind of creating skeletons for new projects. And so we released a Yeoman generator called Gadget. And its purpose is just to an easy way to start a new Drupal project with Grunt Drupal Tasks. So we used to have some instructions of if you're starting a new project with Grunt Drupal Tasks, do this and then this. Now we have a Yeoman generator that makes it very simple to do, and I'll show that in just a minute. This is also released on GitHub, so I encourage you guys to check it out and pull it down. So I'll just get into kind of getting started with the tool and start walking through what you can do with Grunt Drupal Tasks and Gadget. And as far as dependencies, before you start, as I mentioned, this all relies on Node.js, which you can grab from nodejs.org. And then some other supporting tools that you should be aware of. And you might already have these if you're using some of the tools I've spoken about, but especially for Compass, you're going to need Bundler, Ruby, and Ruby gems. Composer is becoming more standard for pulling in PHP libraries. So to get started, like I said, the kind of easiest way to start a new project with Grunt Drupal Tasks is using Gadget. Once you have Node installed, you can use the npm utility to install Gadget and its two dependencies. And this is on the GitHub page for Gadget. And so after you've installed Gadget, the way you can start up then a new Drupal project, this is for kind of starting the scaffold, skeleton, and adding the Grunt Drupal Task tools, is by running yo gadget. And yo is a common way of starting yeoman generators, and then gadget is just the name of that. And like other yeoman generators, this is giving you kind of a prompt-based setup of a new project. So you see it, I don't know how well the colors are showing up or anything, but it's saying, hey, welcome, and then asking you what version of Drupal core would you like to use, and giving you a Drupal 8 or 7 selection. Let's say we choose Drupal 8. It says it's going to start assembling this project. It starts by getting the latest version of Grunt Drupal Tasks. It starts building out a skeleton. It also says it's setting up a Drush makefile to install Drupal version 8, and whichever actual version it is. Here it was beta 10. And you're going to see it kind of processing some stuff, and then it says Gadget is finished. You can run Grunt to run the first build of this project. So let's take a look at what this yeoman generator has produced. And this, again, is this project scaffold. And again, the idea of a scaffold, if you're painting a house, you might need to build or put up scaffolding around the house. So you can actually have access to the house to work on. It gives you a place to put your tools. And that's the idea of a project scaffold is it's kind of creating this structure around your project to make room for tools, for configuration, for other kind of supporting aspects of it. And so this is the kind of project scaffold or skeleton that we suggest using for Drupal sites because of the different kind of accommodations it provides. And I'll walk through that right now. So I'm going to just talk through, again, these are the files that you start with after running the Gadget yeoman generator. A couple just have to do with Grunt Drupal Tasks, project script, and a configuration file. There are a couple things that have to do with the project dependencies. So I talked about Grunt Drupal Tasks helping you install things like Behat and Compass, and those are partially defined by these files. We have a Node modules folder, which is just a typical Node.js. This is where it puts its plugins and libraries. And now we're kind of getting into some Drupal stuff under the source file, folder. And what you'll see here are, typical Drupal directories, modules, profiles, sites, static themes. This is where custom Drupal code and your Drush makefile live. So all the custom Drupal code is under the source directory. And then we have a test directory, which includes any test cases and configuration you have. So we're going to zoom in a little bit to what the source directory is. And the idea, again, is just providing spaces for all the different components you might have in building a Drupal website. You've got your modules directory where custom modules can live, a profiles directory for install profiles, your Drush makefile, a sites directory which can accommodate a single or multi-site configuration, a static directory where you could put static file replacements. So if you want to provide a custom robots.txt file or something else you just want dropped in to the doc root, favicon could be another thing you could put in here. And then your custom themes. And so why are we doing this? Why are we kind of setting up this alternate structure for holding Drupal custom code? Well, first, it's about having a spot for that, and it's about isolating it from the core and contrib code. And by doing this, it can allow some tools to work better together with minimal glue. So, for example, if you're running code quality checks, it's easy to say, just run my code quality checks against all my custom code, and it's easy to do that because it's all in one directory. For something like Behat, which requires some feature test definitions and configuration, we've got a place to put that. And it's about providing a project code base structure that we can standardize that accommodates enough, really probably all of the different aspects we need And so we can know that this is going to be usable in the next project. So, so that's kind of a little bit about the project skeleton. So we're now at a place where the Yeoman generator left off and said you can run Grunt and run your first build of the project. So I want to talk now about what is Grunt going to do to build the project. So, yep. Again, once Grunt Drupal Tasks is installed and set up, you just run Grunt, and that's going to run all the tasks configured by this tool. So what are the steps it's running through? First, it's going to run Composer and Bundler to pull in dependencies for tools that it's using. It's going to run some code quality checkers. It's going to run Drush make to set up your core and contrib. It's then going to take that custom code and files that are in that source directory and inject them into the build output. It can run theme compilation like Compass, and those steps are run as needed. So, for example, it doesn't run Drush make every time you run Grunt. It only does so if it sees that your Drush make file has been updated more recently than the last time you ran Drush make. So it has some niceties in terms of just trying to be smart about what it's doing when you're running this to save time and make the cycle faster. So just to give a quick show of when you run Grunt, it's starting off by running some Composer install. So you see it pulling in some dependencies for Behat. After it completes that, it goes right into running Drush make. I'm not sure how well you can see, but it's pulling down Drupal 8, a few contrib modules. The next few tasks here are kind of file system related tasks. So it's copying things around. It's doing the scaffolding where it's taking your custom code that's in that source directory and making it available to the Drupal doc root that it's building out. And I think it's not showing the theme compilation, but there could be other steps. This is just a simple example. So after we run Grunt, this is now showing again the skeleton directory that we started with, but now there's a few other pieces added here. Most notably, there's a build directory, and under build HTML, here's where you'll see kind of your fully built out Drupal doc root. So this is core that you're seeing, Drupal 8 core checkout. And I'll come back to that in just a second, but just want to also point out some other stuff that's added. These are the dependencies that Grunt Drupal Tasks pulled in. So it's actually giving you a copy of Drush. A lot of this has to do with code quality checks and Behat. But if we go back into the build HTML, so again, this is the root of the Drupal doc root. I want to show how the custom code and files have been brought in. So if we look under modules, we'll see contrib and custom. Contrib has devel, which was pulled in through the Drush make file. But custom is actually a symlink back to source modules. And likewise, if we look under profiles, we'll see a symlink of my site back to source profiles my site. Similarly, under sites, we'll have a symlink from default back to source sites default. There's some other files that can be pulled in here. And themes is very similar to modules, where we have a contrib theme that's been pulled down from d.o and a symlink for our custom themes back to source themes. And so what this has done is kind of interwoven our custom code that's under source with this built-out Drupal doc root. And I do want to talk about Symlinks because it might be a little surprising to kind of see that as part of this. Again, I mean, this is the way that we can have our source files kind of integrated into our Drupal doc root. and not need to do a copy every time. So copying our files from like the source directory into the build output every time we make a change to the source file. By using Symlinks, any changes in the source directory are just transparently reflected into the build output. You don't need to worry about manually setting up these Symlinks. That's something that's done by Grunt Drupal Tasks. The Symlinks are completely relative within this project directory, so they're portable, and you can actually copy this whole project directory to another server, and the Symlinks should still work relative to each other. And things like tools like Xdebug work across Symlinks, so it's not an issue for some of the supporting tools. This can be or it is an issue for Windows users. It hasn't so far been a priority to fully support Grunt Drupal Tasks running on a Windows machine. Often, for our developers who use a Windows machine, they're often working in a VM or some other environment that supports more of the Linux style, file system. So, so far, this hasn't been a major barrier. Although we are considering a workaround to just allowing copy instead of Symlink to support Windows users in that case. But if supporting a Windows system isn't important or a priority for you, this is actually a quite elegant solution to use the Symlinks to be kind of integrating your custom code into the Drupal doc root. So I just want to mention one other way of running the build, and then I'm going to talk about some of the steps in the build. But this is something that we adopted, and it's popular in the kind of Grunt and community, and you've probably seen it. I mean, Compass actually has a watch command, so you might be familiar with this concept of kind of a watch command where you run it, and then anytime it sees a file change, it goes through tasks. So one way you can use this is running grunt watch. What that will do is actually run code validation, theme compilation, a Drush make if it's needed, and other tasks that have been configured whenever it sees files change. So after you do your initial build, you can run a grunt watch, then go leave this running, go work on some files. Let's say you update one of the module files. This is running in the background. It sees that file's been updated and immediately runs code quality checks on it. So now we're getting feedback that's pretty much like coder review module that's like Drupal coding standards. So it's telling you comments are missing or your indents are incorrect. And so this is able to run just automatically as you're working, and so you can have a really nice kind of tight feedback loop between doing some development, seeing the output, and then just being able to iterate on that. And then after it's done, it's now just waiting again for the next change. So it's a nice way to just be able to have that feedback coming to you as you're doing work. And so this kind of build is really what Grunt Drupal Tasks is providing, is kind of this build sequence, which is meant to encapsulate all the kind of key areas of your daily development workflow. And again, the goal is that when you run Grunt Drupal, or Grunt, the default Grunt command, which is the build, it's going to produce a complete Drupal site doc root, which includes your custom source and whatever you've defined in the make file. And we envision that this is what you're doing on a daily or even more frequent basis on your machine locally, on the integration server, to really again kind of enforce automation that once you have this set up to be able to run and rebuild your full Drupal site, it just becomes kind of a luxury that you start taking for granted, that you can do this and not have to worry about changes getting in without intention. So far I've talked about kind of the complete build process, but I do want to talk about the build tasks individually, which you can run individually. And so I want to just step through some of the kind of core tasks that are part of the build process. The first that I've talked about a bit is validating code quality. And so this is about using lints or static code analysis to be able to quantify code quality. And the first kind of code quality checks that we supported were PHP lint and PHP Code Sniffer. And this runs when you run grunt validate. And to just show what the kind of feedback you're getting from that, PHP lint is actually a tool built into PHP, and it's doing just very basic syntax checks. So, if you made a parsing error that would result in like a white screen of death if you actually tried to view this in Drupal, it's going to give you that feedback immediately. There's a parse error. It's expecting a variable and didn't find it. PHP Code Sniffer is a little more nuanced, and that's really about code style. And so here is where we want to provide a way to run kind of a code style checker that uses Drupal's code standards. So again, this is pretty much the same output that you get if you were running code or review within a site or by Drush. PHP CS, again, run within grunt validate is giving you stuff like, hey, you forgot a comment block, or things about like capitalization, like using not using camel case for PHP code, indentation, other kind of code style recommendations like that. And we have actually now also built in ESLint, so you can have your JavaScript linted by the grunt validate task. That was something we just added in the last month or so. So, why is this important? I think I think we often. It's easy to kind of say that in theory you're going to follow code standards, right? But unless you actually have something that's checking and giving you that feedback, it's hard to know how well you're able to do that. And so the idea here is to give developers tools so that on their machine, before they even push the code up, it's easy for them to run these code checks. What that means is that once that code is pushed up, it's hopefully in a cleaner state. And so the peer code review that you might do can focus more on architecture and kind of higher level issues and not be so distracted by poor white spacing or weird kind of indentation or a lack of comments. And you could even take this to the level where you're rejecting pull requests based on too many code style issues, or kind of marking a build as failing once you've built up or accrued a certain amount of code style issues. So having a tool that you can both use on your own machine and also use maybe in kind of development environments, I think is a good way to kind of bolster code quality as you're working. The next thing I'll talk about is theme compilation, and I think it's kind of interesting that Compass was, as far as I am aware, one of the first major non-PHP tools to enter common Drupal practice. It's been a number of years while I've seen Compass integrated in Drupal projects, and I think that's an interesting note. Just as I'm introducing this, which is Node.js based, it kind of begs the question, should we be going outside of PHP? And I think the answer is yeah, where it makes sense and where there are good tools to use. And Node is not the first non-PHP language that's become involved in Drupal development. So one of the things that we want Grunt Drupal Tasks to be able to do is help in that handoff to the theme compilation tool. So we're providing a way to configure Grunt Drupal Tasks to be aware of themes and then be aware of what you might need to do to set up a theme. We have a task that you can run from Grunt compile theme, which will just directly run whatever theme compilation steps you have. And I want to note kind of two different theme compilation approaches that we have support for. One is Compass, and Grunt Drupal Tasks includes a gem file to help you set up Compass, and has some suggested gems you can use with it. Compass compile is just run during that theme compilation step, and so the same output that you'd be used to by running Compass compile, you would see as part of either the full Grunt build or by just running Grunt compile theme on its own. So here we see it writing out some CSS files based on Sass. Another approach that we just have implemented in the last few months is a way for Grunt Drupal Tasks to kick off a Grunt file that's included with a theme. So I haven't seen this yet in a contrib theme on Drupal.org, but internally we've been working on some themes where we're actually putting a Grunt file in the theme itself and having kind of a theme have certain operations it's counting on for Grunt to perform. That could be like JavaScript minification or CSS linting or creating sprites from individual icons. Those are all functions that Grunt is good at playing at. There's a lot of plugins out there for doing that, and so Grunt is definitely widely adopted in the front end community, and so it I think makes a lot of sense to have Grunt doing some work for you at the theme layer. It can even compile Sass to CSS, so you could use Grunt actually in place of Compass for that. And so one thing we wanted to do is allow Grunt Drupal Tasks, which is more of this high-level, it's concerned about building the whole Drupal site, allow it to kind of delegate theme compilation to Grunt files that are packaged with the theme. And so we now have support for this, where you can configure one of your Drupal themes to kind of be Grunt aware, and then Grunt Drupal Tasks will allow the Grunt that's Grunt file or script that's packaged with that theme to run when it's trying to compile themes. So another area that Grunt Drupal Tasks is helping with is testing, and specifically we're a bit more focused on the kind of functional or behavioral testing than unit tests at this point. So Grunt Drupal Tasks by default will provide Behat. I mean, the starting skeleton gives you files that'll help pull down Behat and configure it. But one note is that using Behat requires an installed Drupal site that's accessible by URL. So it can't just run off a code base. You need to have a site that's has a URL that can be hit, is installed, meaning has a database. There's a couple options for running tests locally. Of course, you can use a local environment like a VM or Docker or say setting up MAMP. But another approach that I've kind of become interested in is PHP and Drush actually have a built-in test server. And so we have kind of two commands that help if you want to just spin up a quick Drupal site for testing locally. There's a command called grunt drush light install, and what this does is installs Drupal to a SQLite database. So this is a way you don't have to have MySQL or a database server running locally. SQLite is just stored in a a flat file. And so this is an option to install a Drupal site to this database that sits in a file. And we see it giving you your admin credentials there. And then running PHP or Drush run server. And we actually now have a command, grunt serve. Here it's grunt drush run server, but we've shortened that up a little bit. So grunt serve will run Drush's PHP web server. And when you have that running, you can then run, you can hit it in a web browser. This is just localhost on port 8080. And you can also run the tests against it. So it's kind of a little side note there about this kind of facility for just setting up a very quick local testing environment. I don't think this takes the place of VMs or other ways of doing it, but it is kind of worth mentioning. And so once we have that set up, whether it is using this or whether you've configured it on a VM or whatever locally, you can run grunt test, and that's going to run through all the tests that are configured. And so here it's kicking off Behat, and the output you'd see is similar to if you were just running Behat directly. It's walking through the features that you've defined and reporting, what's passed and what's failed. So, thinking about what this does for you in terms of having kind of testing and behavioral testing at hand, I think this, we're trying to support and start kind of pointing you in the direction of test-driven development or behavior-driven development, where your workflow is writing tests first, coding iteratively, and getting feedback, frequently. Like I showed with the watch tool, you can have the watch tool running, and as you're writing code, you're seeing it run through those test scenarios. And then you have the workflow that's, as soon as your tests are passing, hopefully that means that you're done with that feature. The feature is working, the tests are passing, and so you can be done with that work. And so in an effort to help and support that effort, Grunt Drupal Tasks includes some tools and test scripts to kickstart testing. It actually includes a couple test scenarios that run on a vanilla Drupal 7 site. So out of the box, you can run the tests, see them working, and then kind of use that as a your first step to move on. I think I think a lot of the frustration with using some of the testing tools is just in the setup and getting to the place where you just see anything passing or working. And so we're trying to lower the barrier and provide something out of the box that does work, and then it's up to you to actually write tests that are specific to your use case, but at least that framework is in place. So moving on to packaging and deployment. Really, Grunt Drupal Tasks and this project scaffold I've talked about is really, it's meant for local and local and integration and development environments. And Grunt Drupal Tasks is really mainly focused on preparing code for release. It's not really our intention that it does deployments itself or that it wants to kind of get into that space. It's really about preparing a code base that's ready to hand off to other tools to perform the deployment. But that said, there are a couple places where it can help in doing that first step. So the first thing is that we have the concept of kind of a package run where we're trying to produce a standalone and deployable doc route. So this is taking out those Symlinks I was talking about earlier, which link your custom modules from this one directory into sites all modules custom. You really don't want those Symlinks in something that you're pushing up to your prod server. You just want a simple dereferenced doc route. And so we have something in there for producing that, where it's stripping out the Symlinks and just copying things in place. It's taking out the supporting tools and configuration, so it produces just a clean, simple Drupal doc route. And so there's a command called grunt package. And it actually, this is showing it produce a tar zip, a tarball, but we also have an approach where it just produces a directory with all the .root files. We are thinking about how, where is the right line to draw in the sand between getting code ready and pushing it out. And I think we're kind of narrowing in on where that line is. There are a couple ways I think Grunt Drupal Tasks can support the release process a little more. One, if you're using services like Acquia and Pantheon, where they expect a Git repo that has a specific structure, which maybe it's the doc root right at the root, maybe it's one level up. We want to support that model kind of out of the box. We see that as a very common way of deploying. I mean, it doesn't apply to just those services. It probably applies to almost anybody, but as kind of key hosting, Drupal hosting providers, we want to be aware and kind of prep things for that. So I think this package task gets us pretty close where you're writing output to a certain place. Yeah, we're open to maybe further thoughts about how to make that nicer and just kind of bridge the gap. And then we are thinking a little bit about if there's good ways to integrate this with more formal deployment tools like Capistrano. There's a Node.js project called Shipit that's kind of interesting. So this is an area we're thinking about and would be interested to get feedback on. So that's kind of completes the big kind of major tasks that Grunt Drupal Tasks is providing. I do want to talk a little bit about configuration and extending because, like I've said, we try to provide sensible defaults, but are very aware that there are lots of good reasons to change or want to kind of adapt your workflow. So talking about configuration, configuring is kind of what we call, there are certain settings that we've exposed as being configurable in the grunt-config.json file. This is stuff like the actual paths that your source files are in and your build output. We allow some configuration there in case you don't like our assumptions. You could add, and these are just examples, command line options for Behat. So say you want to always run Behat tests with a certain tag, like work in progress. You're actually only testing certain tests that you're currently working on rather than your whole test suite. Maybe you want to specify some Drush make arguments, and there might be some theme compilation options. So these tools that we're using, we're trying to provide a light way to configure how those tools are run in certain cases. Another example is files to include or exclude from that packaging operation. For example, maybe you want to just throw out changelog.txt or XML RPC before you package it up. So just as an example, an interesting Drush make option is working copy, which allows you to pull down modules and keep their Git files instead of throwing those away. And so just an example of kind of what it looks like to add that as a configuration. And I also have force complete here. But this is a JSON file, and it's pretty straightforward and easy to read. There's a section on Drush, and then we have like make arguments, and you can add whatever arguments you want to send to Drush make there. As far as extending Grunt Drupal tasks, and by extending we mean kind of changing actually the way that like the actual steps it's taking, or even adding programmatic changes to how it's doing its work. This kind of extension is possible through a JavaScript file called gruntfile.js. And here you can add new tasks, replace existing ones. yeah, for maybe we don't yet have JavaScript minification baked into Grunt Drupal Tasks, but maybe you have some huge JavaScript files that you want to minify. You could define a new task to do that as part of your workflow. Define that in the project level gruntfile.js and be on your way. You could also add a task to run a shell script. So you might have some operation you want to run every time you're building. Maybe it's a bunch of Drush tasks like Drush CC and FRA and UpDB. Maybe you put those in a shell script and then add running that shell script as a task to your grunt file. You can also override the steps or the order of steps in the default build process. So an example of an extension, let's say we wanted to add the ESLint plugin to perform JavaScript linting. We could set up a pretty small grunt file. These 2 lines above are included with the skeletons, so it's just these few lines we've added here where we're including another grunt plugin, doing a quick configuration on it, telling it which file we want it to lint, and then doing just a couple lines here to inject that step into the default build process. And then, with these couple lines of configuration or extension, however you look at it, you can run grunt, and then it's going to be running this as part of the default build process. So just to wrap up, this is a project that's definitely been a big collaboration. It'd be great to have more folks interested in it, picking it up, trying it out. So if you're interested in what I've been talking about as a first step, I'd suggest just giving this a try on your next project or just spinning one up today. So that's definitely the first step. Feel free to file issues on GitHub to let us know how you think it could work better or if you run into any issues using it. We're definitely welcome patches. You can submit pull requests on GitHub, and we've in the issue queue on GitHub we've outlined a number of ideas about things we'd like to do in the future. We've tagged some of them help wanted because we think they're good tasks for new contributors to take on. So you could keep an eye out for those. To give you a sense of where we're going with this, we do want to integrate more quality and testing tools. So we now have JavaScript linting. Adding Sass linting is something we're kind of interested in, or adding support for PHP unit, which will become bigger with Drupal 8. As I said, kind of thinking about more options of releasing and deployment, kind of how best to hand off code to those systems. There's an interesting topic about not using Drush Make to build Drupal, especially with Drupal 8, but using Composer instead. And I think I could see that as something that Grunt Drupal Tasks could add support for as an optional approach. I mean, of course, retaining the ability to use Drush Make. There's a project called Drupal Console that's also interesting, especially in the Drupal 8 space, about automating and storing key tasks, and I think that would be a good place for Grunt Drupal Tasks to take a look. And then the Yeoman generator I was talking about before, Gadget, having more options there about what kind of project you want to set up or how it should be structured, I think would be helpful. So being able to choose the type of makefile you have or the type of theme you're using. So that is it. Does anyone have any questions or comments? And let me just pull up the GitHub pages just so you can see that too. Okay, I did not pick up the wireless password. So, I guess I can't do that. But if you search online for Grunt Drupal Tasks, this should come up pretty easily. Any questions? Yeah.
So I probably missed this by coming in a little late. But do you like to compare and contrast or the big advantages you get by using this method versus just like writing scripts like Drush and me?
Yeah.
There's a lot of power within Drush, it seems. I guess I got the feeling that it's sort of leaving some of that behind and thinking of these other tools. Is that true, or is that?
I think we're definitely not trying to replace Drush or kind of get in the way of using Drush for the things that Drush does well. What we're kind of trying to do is provide a wrapper, especially around, now that Drush isn't the only tool that you might be using as kind of a development supporting tool. We're trying to provide something that helps tie that all together. So, I wouldn't say it's not really about replacing Drush as much as making sure it works in concert with some of these other tools. And another big part is that kind of project scaffold idea, the ability to separate your custom code from the core and contrib stuff that's pulled in by DrushMake. I think that's something that DrushMake doesn't itself really offer a solution of how to manage that. I think usually still would put your custom code under kind of core and contrib that you have built by DrushMake. So this is also offering kind of a solution of how to do that.
Originally, you work with the reviewing team, with a team of people, sharing the code that you're working on, and before it's even compiled, before it goes to production. I'm just trying to imagine how you fit in the workflow. Do you have the whole thing in a repository, or do you share with people?
Yeah, we have. So our Git repository is just the pretty much the scaffold. So this is kind of what our Git repository looks like, and then of course there's tons of stuff under here that's more of this slide, right? But so kind of if you go from like a Git repository now, which is like fully built out, you've got core, contrib. One question is, do you have a place to accommodate other supporting tools? Like, do you put your doc root one level down so that you then have a level up to kind of put other stuff? I'm not sure, sure, but so it's it's trying to boil the Git or what it's. So our Git repositories that are now using this skeleton, they don't have core and contrib in them. That's a major thing. And then it's that it's giving you kind of this level to work in that's not yet in your Drupal files. So that's kind of how I would compare.
So you make sure that everyone will have sort of this scaffold in place, and then you source like the modules. That's what you have in the repository.
Yeah. So when you run like Gadget to set up a new project, it's going to put these files in. We don't put node modules in the Git repo, so that would be excluded by like a git ignore. But essentially the rest of the stuff would be in the Git repo. And let's say I start the project and I push it up, and then you want to do development on it. You'll pull it down, you'll run npm install, which will reproduce node modules, and then you'll be ready to run grunt, which will then build out your build directory with the Drupal core and contrib. So yeah, the idea is that this is like the kernel that this is all the stuff you need to share between people, and then everything that can just be downloaded from public sites, we try to do as part of the build process.
I think follow-up question, what do you do after you're finishing a project like production or development and support? Do you get your own compile, look up the production server, and then follow the same thing like scaffolding, do you rebuild, or do you follow a different workflow? updating and
Yeah. I mean, if it was our project beforehand, like if we started it with this, we'd probably just keep doing the same thing. And yeah, I think, I don't think we'd see the need to like commit core and contrib really at any point. So yeah.
Is managing databases part of the build process, or is that not really the scope of this kind of deal?
It isn't really, but yeah, what are your thoughts there? Like,
So yeah, like if I'm in a support mode, for example, and I need the latest version of an actual database to coincide with what I did, and when I get somewhere to pull that down. But that's still, then I mean, it's there are supports to do that to scaffold the structure. So
Yeah.
and then I suppose like just and stuff.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So with the provisioning of like this whole like the site management testing, is that for in the scope of like a client site is that
Hard to say. Yeah. I mean, I think if you're dealing with a fairly, so that also implies that you're kind of able to fully install a Drupal site from code, right? Like with a pretty complex install profile, and maybe you'd have like some migration stuff to pull in content, but it's more of the like starting from scratch approach versus introducing a database. But it wouldn't have to be that way. I mean, I think you could do a SQL sync into the SQLite database too. I just haven't tried that yet, but yeah. So I think to your first point about like how to pull in a database, so maybe you'd have a shell script that's like Drush SQL sync from my integration server or something to my local. We're looking at an even easier way to then run shell scripts as part of Grunt Drupal Tasks. So, if you had a shell script that could do that database copy, there'd be a fairly lightweight way to then integrate that into Grunt Drupal Tasks. Any other questions? All right, thanks very much.